Hello, and welcome to a talk about recent work at Shrewsbury Castle. My name is Nigel Baker. I'm a Shrewsbury-based freelance archaeologist, and I'm going to be telling you about 2 seasons of public excavation in the castle, sponsored by the Castle Studies Trust and supported by Shropshire Council and University Centre Shrewsbury. The work's being carried out by myself, along with Professor Tim Jenkins, Dr Morn Capper of UCS, and by my good friend and colleague Di Williams, based in Herefordshire. And of course by a team of locally recruited volunteers and UCS undergraduates. The story begins in 2018 when I was encouraged to apply for funding from the Castle Studies Trust for a project comprising geophysics and excavation to have a look at Shrewsbury Castle. Why Shrewsbury Castle? Well, because it's one of the more important castles in the region. It was one of those castles established just after Norman conquest in a pre-existing English town. And peculiar as it may seem, Shrewsbury Castle had never been excavated by anybody until we began our work there in 2019. In my project proposal of 2019, I called it one of England's best preserved conquest period Mott and Bailey castles. So let's see if I was right. To begin with some context, here's an air photograph taken by Giles Carey of Shropshire Council, looking down on Shrewsbury from the east. And for those of you who know Shrewsbury well, it's very familiar within its river loop setting. The Severn wraps around 3 sides of the town, and on the open side to the north, the castle occupies about half of the gap between Riverbend and Riverbend. And if we go into the castle and look at it in more detail, this is what I call the familiar castle, the visitable castle. Go have a look at it. It's a most exceptional ancient monument. The grounds are free to enter, and in many ways it looks like it's been parachuted out of a primary school textbook on Mott and Bailey castles. So on the eastern side of the castle, towering over the River Severn below, is the great earthen motte, now with a tower on it known as Laura's Tower, built by Thomas Telford when he restored the place between 1786 and 1790, in the days when it was a private home of Sir William Pulteney MP. Extending out from the motte westwards is what we call the Inner Bailey, surrounded by curtain walls with a postern gate on the north side, and the Regimental Museum, now known as the Soldiers of Shropshire Museum, in one of the castle buildings, which is generally known as the Great Hall, but in actual fact it wasn't. This shot is in fact taken in July of 2019, and you can see our 2019 excavation trench ruining the council's lawn, I'm afraid, for about 3 meters by 10 meters. But it was an extremely interesting exercise. This is another view of the same scene. Again, think classic Mott and Bailey Castle. So the motte cunningly disguised by overgrown trees and overgrown shrubs over on the right, on the east. The castle, so-called hall with the Regimental Museum, and you can just see the flat lawn inside the Inner Bailey, and the ramparts going around the inside of the curtain walls, which have never really been properly dated. They've been said for years to be late 12th century, but really on no terribly good grounds. So let's now have a look at some of the historic mapping. And the best place to begin for anything on Shrewsbury is usually the so-called Burley Map of the 1570s, which is more properly known as a bird's eye view than a conventional map in the modern sense, and shows what was most important to the townspeople. And the castle, although it was in ruins, you can see it there on the right, closing the gap onto the peninsula, was certainly in ruins at that date and had been 100 years that we know about from the documentary evidence. So here is another view of the familiar visitable castle, but as it was towards the end of the 16th century, with the great hall above the word castrum, but with no roof on it. And then to the left of the word castrum, two buildings, one without a roof, which has long been thought to be the ruined castle chapel of St. Michael. But while we would love to have had a look at that last year, we didn't find it. And then in the centre foreground, a building with a roof on in the area of the castle well, which may have been a surviving kitchen building, but we don't really know. On top of the Mott, and the Mott is over here on the right of the screen, there is a single very large round 13th century tower known in later centuries as the Watchtower, and between that and the hall is a smaller tower on the site of the present postern gate. This is a plan in the RIBA collection made by John Smithson in 1627, and I've always assumed it's a kind of architect's back of a fag packet kind of measuring up sketch for a job which it seems never actually happened, at least not for a very long time. And it shows very conveniently the state wall by wall of the castle as it was at that time. So there are various legends attached to the walls. So the one on the north curtain wall says this wall is part standing. This wall is part standing. It says of the western curtain wall, and of the hall itself, so-called hall, it says this building is ruined. So that's pretty clear. And where we now just have a normal, well, not a normal, but just a simple gateway through the curtain wall. In those days there was still a gatehouse. There again is the tower on the top of the Mott. And now let's fast forward to what it looks like today. And I think the easiest way of introducing Shrewsbury Castle is to take this much as a tourist would and go and have a look round, starting at the front door. So here we are, we're looking north, not yet in the Inner Bailey, we're looking at the main gateway with flanking walls either side. We know that those were built between 1643 and 1644 when the Royalists were in control of the castle, because their expenditure on refortifying the castle and in fact refortifying Shrewsbury town centre is recorded in the contemporary mayor's account. So we know item by item what they built and how much it cost. And kind of weirdly, rather than what I take to be the usual Civil War practice of refortifying sites, places, buildings in timber and earthwork, in Shrewsbury everything was done the old way, and new stone walls were built either from freshly quarried stone or from salvaged stone. One detail which we want to get to the bottom of, maybe with some experimental work, can be seen on the door leaves within the gateway. And if you see the inset bottom left, you can see one of the door leaves, again dating to the Royalist work of 1643-44, but it's studded with small semicircular holes which are about a centimetre deep. They're about, sorry to mix my units, but about 0.75 of an inch in diameter. And when I saw these, I wondered if they were battle damage, but I'm assured by musket experts that if you just fire a musket from even 100 meters away at this solid oak door, the shot will go right through it. So quite what's going on, whether they've passed through an outer door first before thudding into the woodwork of the inner gate, we don't know. But we know that there was an outer door in front of the barbican. Proceeding into the Inner Bailey, on the far side, you come to the postern gate, which you see the inside face of, top left, cunningly disguised by gardeners' wheelie bins. And then bottom right, you can see the outside of the postern gate, obviously a multi-phase structure, but we know from John Smithson's plan that it was basically a rebuilding of an earlier structure on the same site. And then back up in the air just to remind you of the general layout of the place. We've come through the front gate, we've looked at the postern gate there, had a brief look at the outside of the postern gate, and we're now, I think, about to look at what is generally known as the Great Hall, but was in fact referred to in documents between 1239 and 1241, when it was built for a cost of about £650 as the Camera Regis, in other words, the King's Chamber. In other words, this wasn't a royal hall as such, not in the sense of an open hall or feasting hall for public occasions. This was basically the King's royal apartments, and the identification, the dating of the building is helped immensely by good dendro dates on timbers embedded in the masonry with a felling date in the 1230s and later. You go inside and have a look at the woodwork that you can see more easily. You have a flat pitch king post roof over the main body of the hall and a screen at one end, which was damaged by the IRA, in fact, in the firebomb attack in the 90s. These two have been dendro dated, and peculiarly they came out at 1647 to 8, which puts them firmly in the date bracket for the parliamentarian occupation of the castle after they got in February 1645. So it looks like the parliamentarians were actually continuing their predecessors' policy of spending money hand over foot on the castle. Outside the Inner Bailey, we have the outer face of the curtain walls, which are an abiding mystery in the sense that they've been photographed, but they've never been properly recorded or analysed, and all the fabric changes that you can see within the masonry have never really been identified or mapped. So if you look at the bottom left image, you can see that there's a very clear distinction between the small, rather bad rubble-built section occupying the bottom 2 meters of the wall and the material above, which is mostly reused stone, but obviously contains several periods of work. The occurrence of rubble masonry around the curtain walls is, I think, something that's quite important, because it most likely relates to work that was carried out before the end of the 12th century, or certainly before the 13th century was very old. And I'll come back to that a bit later. The Mott. The Mott is a problem. It was a problem for castle occupants because it's poised over a bend in the river and has been subjected to erosion from the river at its base. So an inquiry in 1255 was held because part of it had collapsed into the river, and river erosion was blamed, quite rightly, I'm sure, for that problem. This hasn't been an issue in recent years. I think the issue in recent years has been the degree to which the Mott is invisible, because you've got dense planting dating to the 1980s on the inner slope of the Mott, which was never designed to have got that lush and tall. It just has grown out of control, and it's only very recently that Shropshire Council have seized the bull by the horns and began felling work on the outside face of the castle, on the eastern slopes of the Mott. And so we see here some of the newly revealed medieval masonry of the Mott top on the eastern side. So in the foreground we see the foundations of the 13th century round so-called Watchtower, which in fact stood to its full height until Thomas Telford demolished it between 1786 and 1790. And then beyond it you can see the wall, the parapet, and the wall below that seals off the damaged, eroded east side of the Mott top. And it's very satisfying that the wall is stripy, and as soon as I realised it was stripy, I immediately began to think about the walls of Carnarvon Castle and the masons of Edward I, and thought, hey, this is Shrewsbury's own little bit of Constantinople. But since then, I've been reliably informed by a Caddo inspector who knows more about castles than I ever will do, that there are quite a lot of stripy walls at this date, scattered through Wales. So it's not just Shrewsbury and Carnarvon, it's a more general phenomenon. And then one of my favourite features, because outwardly it's just about the most boring thing in the castle, all it really needs is a pair of gnomes with fishing rods to complete it. It's the so-called castle well, which you can see here. This is probably part of the work done in 1925, when the castle ceased to be a private residence and was taken over by Shrewsbury Borough Council for use as a meeting hall. And the castle hall was restored by Sir Charles Nicholson, and the grounds too were restored, and the so-called castle well that you see here, with no water in it at all, was a feature probably of that date. However, if you go round the back, and if you're lucky enough to be able or allowed to lift up the manhole cover around the back of this, below this structure there's an inspection chamber, and leading off the inspection chamber is actually the real castle well, which seems to be of late medieval date. It's a really nice sandstone built well, recorded as I think 73 feet deep down to water level, which you can just see in that slide, which is down at the level of the river. Here's the castle as it was in 1882, the wonderful first edition Ordinance Survey 1 to 500 plans. And before I go any further, I just want to point out once again, we've been looking around the visitors monument, the obvious castle here. And I just want to point out where the cursor is, some of the detail shown by the Ordnance Survey within the Bailey, particularly the castle greenhouses as they stood at that date. I'll be coming back to those a little bit later on, but the main purpose of showing you this slide is to alert you to the fact that the castle that we know and love today is less than half of what I call the real Shrewsbury Castle, which had an outer bailey which disappeared because it was built over gradually in the course of the 13th century. Anybody with an eye for topography has probably already grasped this just by looking at the details on the map. So the curve around here of School Gardens is actually tracking alongside the inner edge of the outer bailey rampart. The way the street constricts at that point, that's a familiar topographical feature that you see in English towns or even French towns where there have been gates that have been removed. So if we cut to the chase, we can reconstruct the outlines of the outer bailey with some accuracy using excavated evidence from the Castlegates library site back in the 70s, topographical evidence of the kind that I've just outlined, but also documentary evidence. The late Bill Champion, historian, told me that all of the properties from this point onwards, this is the old co-op site for anybody who knows Shrewsbury very well, all of the properties from there northwards paid ground rents to the Crown. All the properties from that point southwards paid their ground rents to the borough. So the footprint of the Outer Bailey survives even as a kind of a ghost in the taxation records. And then we move on to 2019 and the beginning of the Castle Studies Trust's project. And we began that with a phase of geophysical survey by specialist contractors, the Roseveres, known as Tiger Geo. And they ran resistivity and ground penetrating radar over the whole of the Inner Bailey and its ramparts to let us have a look at what lay below the grass and to begin to assess our excavation priorities. And you can see the site of our first trench, our 2019 Trench 1, which is laid out across the big orange blob, which was no great surprise to us to see when the results came back, because generations of castle custodians had reported that the lawns in front, immediately in front of the castle hall, parched out in dry summers, and you could, they thought, see the walls of ruined buildings lying just below the turf. And this is indeed what the geophysicists thought that we had there. They suspected that that orange and yellow mass was basically a spread of demolished building rubble. Of course, I began to think, well, if the so-called hall is in fact a chamber block, maybe the royal hall, the ground floor hall, the feasting hall, lies awaiting our trowels just under the grass in front of the tarmac apron in front of it. It didn't quite work out like that, as I'll explain in a second. Ground penetrating radar was also used and produced completely different or complementary results. So there is, if you follow the cursor, a mass of detailed information which we're never really going to look at below. It's buried below the tarmac of the drive in front of the museum building, the castle hall. There is a massive activity around the base of the Mott, which you see here. And then over under the western rampart is this very intriguing looking series of walls perpendicular to each other, which the geophysicists reported as a buried building, a deeply founded buried building, and one of a lot of interest because it was potentially on the site of the documented St. Michael's Chapel. Come back to that a bit later on. So here we are looking east from the roof of the castle hall and museum, over the lawns of the Inner Bailey, towards the Mott, which is invisible because of its tree cover. You can just see Laura's Tower towards the top of it. And there is our Trench 1, opened up 10 metres by 3, staffed by UCS students in blue uniforms and local volunteers, and much visited. We had between 4,000 and 5,000 visitors in the course of a couple of weeks in July 2019, and as people say, it was completely bonkers in terms of, you know, a busy site with a lot going on and a lot of visitors to explain it all too. And almost immediately, like day 2, day 3, we were onto a hard surface, which obviously corresponded to the yellow and orange mass that we'd seen on the resistivity survey. The problem was that we were obviously not looking at the ruined remains of a medieval hall, we were looking at gravel. And for the whole first 5 or 6 days of the excavation, we were wondering what on earth this gravel was. You know, was it a driveway, a predecessor of the present drive, approaching the hall? But no, in fact, digging a test pit through it proved that we were actually on the top of natural geology already. In other words, when in terms of vertical stratigraphy, under the modern turf, there was a very, very thin layer of topsoil. The turf itself was massively thick. It was about 9 inches or so thick, the most horrendously tough turf I've ever experienced because it was 200 years old. It was a lawn that I think had been laid out by Thomas Telford's landscape gardeners in about 1790, having basically denuded, scraped flat the whole of the interior of the Inner Bailey first. In other words, most of the archaeology had been taken away 200 years before we got to the site. But all was not lost because, as you see from this slide, it's not just a flat mass of gravel, there are holes punctured through it, and some of those are of serious archaeological interest. And here, just for a bit of illustration, is a painting done in about 1800 showing the Pulteney family He was the town's MP, as you can see here, between 1774 and 1805. Just after Thomas Telford's restoration. So there's the family standing in the drive, more or less where the driveway is now, and you can see the castle building in its newly restored state. Back to the hole, here is our trench from the eastern end. So the Mott is behind the camera. We're looking west, and it just gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the holes that were found to have been punched through the gravel surface. And the most interesting and by far the largest of these is in the foreground, from the 2-metre stripy ranging pole forward towards the camera, cross diagonally by a 1925 water pipe. And this was a very broad, the whole width of the trench, shallow or shallow sloped feature that we never got to see the bottom of, and there was no sign of a return to it. What was interesting was that this coincided exactly with the end of the hard material which had been shown to us by the Geophysical Survey. And as we excavated it, we began to get layers that were solely medieval from their pottery contents, but also contained two satisfyingly military artifacts in the form of a couple of iron arrowheads, which are being identified for us as we speak, or as I speak. There is our trench, showing its location again in relation to the resistivity results, and you get the idea, I think, from this that the shallow sloped hole that we found occupying the easternmost 3 meters of our trench is in fact part of a much more general feature describing an arc which is concentric about the base of the Mott. And there it is actually laid out on the ground. This is the edge of the feature which we're excavating as defined by geophysics either side of the excavation trench. This is looking south towards the castle gateway, and I'm sure you're way ahead of me here, and you realise that, of course, as people say, we were digging in the beginning of the Mott ditch. An infilled Mott ditch, we had no idea that it was there, or at least nothing other than a vague suspicion that it was there, but it must have been 10 or 12 meters wide, at least 4 or 5 meters deep, and kind of was a new light on the Mott, which is easily disregarded, partly because it's covered in trees and difficult to see, partly because it only rises about 10 meters above the height of the Bailey, though it's a good 100 feet above the river. But this Mott ditch reminded us that the Mott itself was taken very, very seriously, as part of the early castle, was a strongly fortified feature. Going back to the other holes, and this is looking back at trench 1, there is the edge of the Mott ditch, the last 3 meters of the trench. Amongst the other holes punctured through the natural gravel were some Victorian flower beds, which you see on the left of the 2-meter ranging pole, but also some medieval pits, and the one on the right, the deep one bottom right in the foreground, pit 20, was of peculiar interest because of its contents. What it contained was not one but 2 different kinds of Preconquest Anglo-Saxon pottery. The larger sherd at the bottom is a rim of Stafford type ware, probably made in kilns in Stafford, and was used between about 900 and the middle of the 11th century. And that's the standard Shrewsbury kind of Preconquest late Saxon pottery. You find it all over town. But the piece, the kind of rather kind of scrofulous looking bit at the top with the holes in its fabric, that was the real pleasant surprise. In fact, for me, it was the best thing of the season, I think, in that that is a piece of pottery romantically called type fabric TF41A, where it's normally found, which is in the city of Gloucester. and it was made in that area. It's tempered with Cotswold limestone. It's very familiar to the archaeologists in the city of Gloucester, but it's the first bit that I'm aware of that has ever been found in Shrewsbury or in this part of the country. And it makes me very happy because we're kind of lacking evidence that the Severn was used before the Norman Conquest, or in fact before documentary evidence, as a commercial waterway. And this is really, I think, fairly sound evidence, that there was traffic coming up and down the Severn before the Norman Conquest. But then, of course, the big question is, what was it doing here? What was the pre-conquest presence at the castle all about? The simple answer is, well, the simple answer will have to wait until I've just shown you a piece of a possible bone comb or a knife handle which came out of the same pit. But the answer to what was happening on the site of the castle before the Norman Conquest, I think, must lie in some kind of military rationale, because Shrewsbury is a peninsular town, is most likely to have defended against the outside world. And we know it was defended because we have a place named Shrewsbury, Shrewsborough, or Burrig, or Buch. It's an Anglo-Saxon word. We know coins were minted here by the 930s, which is a sure sign that the place was defended. The defences themselves have never been found by archaeologists, but they would almost certainly have run across the neck of the peninsula, and the castle occupies one end of the medieval outer town wall, which you see in red here. At the far end is a feature known in later accounts as Garrawald's Castellum, about which we know very little other than that it has an old English personal name attached to it. At the opposite end of that stretch is a hill which later developed the castle. And so I think it's almost inconceivable that the borough of Shrewsbury, would not have defended this hilltop in such a tactical position. So we've been able to prove that there's something going on the site of the castle before the Norman Conquest. It's just a question of really finding out a bit more detail about that. So come back in a couple of hundred years and we may have the answer. Okay, just to introduce the 2020 season, last year's season, you may recall this ground penetrating radar plot and this extremely interesting looking buried structure under the western rampart. This was such an obvious target for research that we couldn't really not apply to Castle Studies Trust for a second grant to have a look at it, but perhaps more fundamentally to examine the structure of the rampart itself. I'll explain. Here is a picture of our 2020 season hole being sunk through the western rampart. But the question was, how much of a rampart, of that rampart in particular and the ramparts in general, how much of it was real? I mean, if Thomas Telford had scraped the interior of the Ian Bailey flat, as we saw the previous year, what did he do with the stuff? I mean, this was a question first posed by Martin Rosefier, geophysicists. Are the ramparts real? Are they in fact a confection, a piece of landscape gardening archaeology by Thomas Telford? So we were agog to find out what the rampart was composed of and what this mysterious building was. So we sunk our hole, as you can see it here, on the site of the 19th century greenhouses, basically on the rationale, or with the rationale, that we could basically put a hole in part of Shrewsbury Castle, which we knew had already been damaged. We weren't going to be digging up pristine, unthreatened deposits, because the Victorians we knew had been there before us and must have cut their greenhouses into the slope. So maybe this would give us a fast way into the body of the rampart material so we could find out what it was made of. And yea, verily, the first stuff that we found was the remains of the mid-19th century greenhouse, and in fact, as an added bonus, if you like to see it that way, we found the remains of a builder's lime mixing pit with the lime putty still pliant and plastic, and here you can see a half-sectioned lime mixing pit still with a lot of white material in. That's the builder's lime from mixing for lime mortar, and it had been backfilled with bits of broken up bathtub of a truly industrial scale, and lots of medicine bottles for laxatives and pick-me-ups, and just all the detritus that seemed to suggest builders gutting a building and throwing out everything from bathroom fittings to bell pulls, literally. And we were pretty clear on the dating of that pit that was in fact part of a 1925 restoration, but as you can see, it's cut through the partly backfilled remains of the Victorian greenhouse, which is cut into the slope, which you can see here as we cleaned up that phase at the end of the first week of excavation. So what you're looking at is volunteer Terry cleaning up the remains of a cement bedding for a quarry tile floor, which was taken away, the back wall of the greenhouse, through which you access the body of the greenhouse down the 2 steps that you can see, and the front greenhouse, this side of volunteer Terry, with a heat duct along the double thickness of the wall. And you also know we're about 80 centimetres at that point down from the 1 metre scale that you can see along the rear section. Now, we know quite a lot more about the greenhouse than you might suppose just from looking at its footings, for the peculiar reason that when the greenhouse was taken down sometime between 1901 and 1925, it wasn't just smashed up and thrown away, it was dismantled and taken to a private property in Shrewsbury town centre, where it still is. And following up a hot tip from the castle custodian, I went to visit it and its owner, who I happen to know, back in July, I guess, last year, in a kind of in that brief non-lockdown period. And there it is, in slightly tired condition. But it's a very peculiar experience to be excavating a site, having had a cup of tea in the superstructure that once covered it a couple of months beforehand. But we know from the curved form of the greenhouse that it's of that mid-19th century appearance. Think Crystal Palace, Joe Paxton's greenhouses. Anyway, the greenhouse was just kind of stage 1 on the way down through the body of the rampart. Here we are, having sort of narrowed the scope of the hole a bit. We've punched through the greenhouse floor, and what we're doing now is working through destruction deposits of various kind, starting with a layer covering the whole trench of a foot, 18 inches or so of roof tile rubble, which you see there. It's the red material in the sections, with layers of burning and beginning of a pit coming out there with part of a broken up stone windowsill in. The tile was interesting. It seemed to be of 17th or maybe early 18th century date, and I'm pretty certain it came from a row of buildings which had stood along the inside of a drive, built sometime after the 1620s, because they're not there on Smithson's plan, but probably demolished by Telford around about 1790 as part of his kind of Reformation campaign of the garden. But just in terms of where we are within the body of the rampart, we're now a metre down below the surface, and we're still in post-medieval deposits. A week later, we're another metre down, having, for safety, narrowed the trench down again to leave a step, so that the sections wouldn't be outside health and safety guidelines to ensure the stability of the hole. Here's my good friend Di Williams standing proudly in the trench on its final day of excavation, and basically the step that he's got his left arm resting on is still at post-medieval state. So medieval strata began, or I should say strata containing only medieval finds began, I think, one layer down from Dyer's left arm, and we can see this finished hole at 2.3 meters below the surface. So our funding kind of came to an end at just about the same time as we reached health and safety limits, and we ran out of time. So it all neatly ended at 2.3 meters after 3 weeks of excavation, and we were still in a strata that spot dating of the pottery from Stephanie Ratkai has shown we're still producing 15th century material, or at least a sherd of 15th century material. And I think the next slide are the artifacts, some of the artifacts from the lower layers. For that year, I photographed all the artifacts as soon as they'd been cleaned up, as they came out of the ground, context by context, because I always find it difficult once the contexts have, the finds have been separated by material. It's a good aide-memoire, I find, to have the digger's eye view, the way that all the finds sort of pile up in the finds trays, the mixture of animal bone in big bits or small bits, pottery in big bits or small bits, and so on and so on and so on. So this is from my post-excavation commencement photography, but one of the problems of doing this sort of thing on a garden table at 87 Brompton here is that you get furry people coming to play on the garden table, and I do apologise for Miles the cat in the bottom left-hand slide. But there we have a distant view of our hole approaching its conclusion. And what was remarkable about the sequence was that at 2.3 meters down below the surface at that point, we were below the level of the drive, and we were below the level of the main lawn of the Inner Bailey, and we were in fact below the level of the natural gravel which we'd seen in the previous year's excavation. So I'll just go into this, just unpack this a bit. So here we have an interim section showing last year's trench in the western rampart. Here's the curtain wall on the outside and the beginning of the drop down towards castle gates in the outside world. Here's trench 2 with a step in it, more or less reflecting the top of medieval, and 15th century deposits still at the bottom. And here across the drive is levels transferred across from our trench 1 of 2019, showing the top of the natural gravel, beginning of the Mott ditch not very far away. And the conclusion had to be from our hole that whatever we were digging on, there was no sign whatsoever of natural. In other words, the level of the natural hilltop must be dropping somewhere between last year's excavation and this year's excavation. And if that's the case, it provides a reason for not finding, for instance, a medieval rampart or a buried soil or a pre-conquest buried occupation surface, a natural at the bottom of our last year's hole, which is kind of what we've been hoping for and kind of expecting, but it wasn't, that sort of material wasn't there. And there was no sign before any of the experienced diggers amongst you go, aha, you were probably sinking such a small hole down the middle of some thundering great negative feature like a well. All the stratigraphy was pretty flat. There was no suggestion that we were digging our tiny sample within some larger negative feature. What we found, I think, was representative of the stratigraphy at that point. In other words, we had a big question now about the shape of the original medieval castle, or I should say the 11th and the 12th century Norman castle. So here we have a slide which gathers together evidence for the pre-13th century castle. So Around the curtain wall, some bits of the curtain wall are constructed, as we've seen already, in rubble, which contrasts with the ashlar, which seems to be characteristic of 13th century and later work. So we've got bits of rubble wall along the north perimeter on the north side, wing wall running up the Mott, and on the Mott top itself. Here is our Mott ditch, which we defined in 2019 with the help of excavation at that point and with geophysics. And you can just see added on for good measure an assessment of what the top of the Mott might have looked like before it slid into the river in the course of the 13th century. And now we have to think that maybe the western perimeter of the Inner Bailey has been enlarged, and that somewhere under the rampart we have the beginning of the drop down, the natural hilltop dropping down to the west, and that what happened in the opening years of the 13th century, when the king was spending huge amounts of money, culminating in the construction of the new chamber block of 1239 to 41 up there. I think what is going on is that the original Inner Bailey has been expanded by pushing the ground out to the west and building it up behind the new curtain wall. And this is a very familiar practice in medieval Shrewsbury, not confined to the castle. This is something that Martin Carver found out about Shrewsbury many, 50 years ago. That Shrewsbury is a town of terraces, and I think in Trench 2 last year we were digging in massive landfill deposits in what I think of as a Carver terrace. So just to kind of return to the reality of the APs, here is our Inner Bailey, there's our 2019 trench straight onto gravel, and I think if we wanted to follow gravel all the way down, we would have to contend with a very steep slope down to the outside world, which begins somewhere on along a line looking a little bit like that. So one question is answered, which is, was that rampart, the western rampart in particular, and the ramparts in general, were they medieval features, genuine parts of the castle's defences? And the answer is no, they're not. They seem to be mostly post-medieval in date, and I think Thomas Telford is very firmly in the frame for having created the present appearance of the interior of the Inner Bailey. But the other question which arises from this work is, given that the Inner Bailey was much smaller than it now appears, given that half of it was occupied by a thundering great ditch at the bottom of the Mott, and at least a third of it was created possibly in the 13th century by pushing the ground out to the west. If this building here, the Castle Hall, is a chamber block, where was the Royal Hall? We know that Henry II had a Royal Hall here. We know that Henry III, Edward I had a Royal Hall here. Where was it? Where were the most important castle buildings? And this is definitely one for the future, but I think sitting here now in 2021, the answer is that all the most important stuff in Shrewsbury Castle was on top of the Mott. And it's interesting that 2 or 3 times the central government records for expenditure at Shrewsbury Castle refers to Shrewsbury Castle as the Tower of Shrewsbury. And I think that it may be to contemporaries that Shrewsbury Castle was all about verticality. It was all about the tower on the top of the Mott and the buildings around its base. And one interesting feature came out of the survey work which we did which was that the Mott top is at an altitude of about 80 meters above sea level. Which doesn't mean anything of its own accord, but when you realise that the site of the Anglo-Saxon Royal Hall, close to St Mary's Church and the site of the Parade Shopping Centre, is also on a plateau at about 80 metres above sea level, And the other great early pre-conquest site in Shrewsbury is the Minster Church of Old St Chad's, which is on the southern Shrewsbury town centre hilltop. And that too is about 80 metres above sea level. You begin to wonder whether there was some kind of Trumpian imperative going on here. And William the Conqueror maybe said to Roger of Montgomery, well, I'm damned if I'm going to have my hall any lower than these Englishmen have their halls. Make sure that you build the Mott a good 30 feet above the level of the Bailey. I'm damned if I'm going to be overlooked. But that's pure guesswork. But there does seem to be evidence, and I meant to look at that in the previous slide, so I'll just go back to that, and I can't, that the Mott top was built up. When you look at the evidence of the early illustrations, the previous slide was a sketch from 1786, just before Thomas Telford started work, but it shows more or less the same kind of detail as this, which is a panorama of the 1640s and shows the walls on the top of the Mott with the very clear signs that there have been windows in it for buildings which have been removed. In fact, you can still see there is the gable of a surviving timber frame building up there. So that's really the end of what I have to say. I hope very much we will be back for another season. We've sampled an inner Bailey Rampart and found it to be bogus, at least most of it. We've sampled the interior and found it to be stripped bare, but nevertheless of great archaeological interest. For the moment, work has concluded as the Mott top is sealed by a cobbled surface that is just at the moment too expensive to tear up and reinstate. But Castle Studies Trust, Shropshire Council, Historic England and COVID-19 permitting, I hope one day that we'll be back. Go have a visit. Shewsbury Castle is the most fantastic monument. Thank you for listening.